I want to begin by acknowledging the privilege of gathering here with you and speaking on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas, a territory that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. In November 2018, the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership launched I Am London, an online campaign to highlight the stories of refugees and immigrants. When you visit the I Am London website, you will meet Afiz Ajibowi, who came here from Nigeria with his family, complete with a master's degree in science from the United Kingdom, a career background in sales in the private sector, and is now working in project management at a local school board. You will meet Fan Lu, who came as an international student to study business and ended up changing her focus to psychology and volunteering at various local organizations. She's now working at the John Howard Society to help build bridges between newcomers and service providers in London. This is Ontario's immigration story. It is a story of people who came here to make a new life, who are doing well economically, relatively speaking, and who are making important contributions to their community and the economy. It is the story Ontario and Canada would like the world to know, the story of immigration. The kind of story that gives many of us inspiration, hope, and a sense of purpose to build strong and welcoming communities. The kind of story that reminds us of what Canada is all about, who we are as a people, and what we want to be in the future. And we also have the story we also know that Canada's story of immigration is also a story of colonization. The immigration project has always been about settler-colonialism and enriching the empire. Note that neither the federal nor provincial immigration laws make any reference to First Peoples, let alone our treaty obligations to First Peoples. And let me pause here to acknowledge, and I always have to do this as a woman of African descent, so let me pause here to problematize that not all of us here can be defined as settlers. We have a different historical and contemporary relationship, and when I say we, I'm talking about my people, my ancestors, those of us who are of African descent. We have a very different historical and contemporary relationship to Indigenous peoples in the Americas. My ancestors who were enslaved and brought here to labor throughout these lands were not complicit in the colonial project, but we do have a responsibility and a role to play in upholding the rights and standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here in Ontario and across Canada. Ontario's immigration strategy, released in April 2017 under the previous government, but which can still be found on the provincial website as of earlier this week, and I say this because every time I go to look for something, it's gone. It has a preamble that reads, "A new direction for immigration in Ontario, attracting highly skilled workers and their families, supporting diverse communities, and growing a globally connected economy." The Ontario Immigration Act of 2015 recognizes the role immigrants play in growing the economy, as well as the importance of family and humanitarian commitments, an acknowledgement that Ocasio insisted had to be present in the legislation, and Leonie was also part of that expert working group that developed the report that led to our legislation. But the Act very clearly lays out Ontario's main priority, which is the selection of immigrants for economic priorities to address labor market needs in collaboration with municipalities and employers. So what are the expectations of stakeholders? Ontario continues to be the biggest player and biggest beneficiary in Canada's immigration project. By the end of 2018, Ontario had welcomed 137,000 people who arrived as permanent residents, with the majority being people in the skilled worker stream. It was an increase of over 25,000 over the previous year. And we should note that there has been a steady increase since 2015, a long-awaited reversal of a trend that saw our numbers decrease throughout the previous decade. In fact, during the decade prior, under the previous government, the previous federal government, Ontario's permanent resident numbers went into a steady decline from about over 125,000 in 2006 down to 95,000 in 2014. While Canada's overall immigration numbers either went up or remained more or less the same. Ontario was losing its share of immigration to other parts of the country, primarily Alberta and BC. And I won't go into all of the shenanigans of the former Conservative government that caused quite a decrease in our numbers. So the Express Entry Program actually is helping Ontario's numbers. We now have a provincial government that has not put out an immigration policy or even a position, although we can probably infer a lot from the statement that our current Premier made during the provincial election campaign last year that Ontario should take care of its own first. And the fact that the province with the largest share of immigration does not have a dedicated minister or ministry for immigration and refugee settlement, integration, and inclusion. This is telling. But Ontario will continue to benefit from immigration. In fact, many communities, especially in Northern Ontario and other rural areas, and Sunil's graph was telling in terms of we see how little immigrants are going to areas outside of the major cities. But Northern Ontario and other rural areas in the province had made it very clear that they are counting on immigration to not only succeed economically, but need it for their very survival, given the demographic challenges many are facing. In fact, it's stakeholder role, and so whether or not the province acknowledges it, it is an important stakeholder in immigration. In fact, its stakeholder role, and these are smaller and rural communities, is described in legislation, public policy, and intergovernment agreements like the Canada-Ontario Immigration Agreement and the Canada-Ontario-Toronto Memorandum of Understanding. I was in Sudbury yesterday, and many of you may have heard about the federal government's new pilot project for rural and Northern Ontario, where they will identify 2,750, I believe, seats, and small centers are invited to put in application. I think the deadline is coming up sometime in the next week, and it was really interesting to be part of the conversation that's happening in the North in terms of how is it that we can attract and retain immigrants. I think for the first time around the table, you have mayors, you have economic councils, you have faith communities, you have service organizations, and you have regular folks all coming together to talk about how important immigration is and what it is that they need to put in place to attract and retain. One note of concern, however, was that rumor has it that the federal government is actually trying to reduce the numbers that was announced to 1,100 as opposed to the 2,700, which we didn't think was enough in the first place. I'm going to take that extra 3 minutes that Leonie didn't use. Anyways, so in looking forward, that was just an aside. In looking ahead to the future, Ontario must also find a way to work with the many stakeholders that have an active interest in immigration, including immigrants and migrants themselves, refugees, including refugee claimants, OCASI and the immigrant serving sector here in Ontario, the private sector, industry groups, business associations, and employer associations, municipalities, the education system, especially school boards and public and private universities. I think for the first time we're seeing that we have more international students here in Ontario than we have permanent residents and or migrant workers, which in itself is a significant change in terms of numbers. So, for example, we have 264,000 international student permit holders currently in Canada, and that is compared to the total number of people who came as permanent residents, which was about 137,000. And so we will see that Ontario actually received almost twice as many international students than we did permanent residents. There is something there in terms of how we tap into international students as our source for immigration to Canada. So really needing to look at our point system and how and the kind of policy changes that need to be made so that we're not only looking at postgraduates transitioning to permanent status, but we're also looking at undergraduates who may want to stay in Canada. But what does this all mean for us as we look ahead to Ontario's immigration future? Given immigration selection criteria, only a small number of the more than 250,000 international students who arrived in 2018 will qualify to stay as permanent residents, if that's what they want to do. Meanwhile, they will be living and studying here and working. They don't qualify for federally funded settlement services. And I realized that when Adnan was speaking, he identified the various groups that's left out of the federally funded, and you didn't mention international students, so I wasn't sure if that was a political decision that you made, that international students should not be included in federally funded services. Certainly a point of contention within the sector and across the country. So many folks are now saying that the universities and colleges who are benefiting from international students' fees should be contracting with settlement workers themselves and using that money to deliver services. I think it's a discussion that we can continue to have. I think there's some merit to that. I'll skip over some of this stuff. We heard from Sunil about women and earning less than men, but I wanted us to talk about, and Sunil didn't talk about it, that while women, and in particular immigrant women, earn less than men, and I think we're looking at women in Ontario earn 29% less than men, that number jumps to 43% when we look at Indigenous women, 38% when we look at women of color, and 34% when we look at immigrant women. Consider the fact that international work experience is a plus point for Canadian-born workers, but it is the opposite for immigrants and refugees, not to mention the impact of all the other factors of race, ethnicity, and faith. Looking ahead, how do we ensure that Ontario's prosperity is not built on the exploitation of refugees, immigrants, and migrants? Granted that Ontario's prosperity is not equitably shared, but that is a conversation for another way. What is our responsibility to ensure that Ontario's immigration adventure does not further perpetuate settler colonialism? What is our responsibility as a sector, specifically the immigrant and refugee serving sector, that the government refers to as the settlement sector, to hold our governments accountable to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and the call to justice for missing and murdered Indigenous sisters, and much more. And I promise I will end in exactly 1 minute. As we look ahead to Ontario's immigration future, I don't want to downplay the serious challenges ahead. We have a provincial government that has talked a lot about putting the province's fiscal house in order and is hell-bent on finding efficiencies, that has cut some provincial services and has either announced or hinted at cutting other services. This is despite the fact that Ontario's per capita spending on programs is the lowest of all provinces, according to a report last month from the Financial Accountability Officer. We don't know if the province will maintain services for people with precarious immigration status, including refugee claimants. We don't know what's ahead for Ontario's poverty reduction strategy, one where we fought to have the disproportionate disadvantage of people of color, as well as refugees and immigrants, recognized. We don't know what's ahead for Ontario's Anti-Racism Directorate, which was tasked with the responsibility for implementing disaggregated data collection across all of government, which is a significant policy lever to recognize and then move to address disproportionate disadvantage on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, immigration status, as well as many other factors like disability. We are looking ahead to a federal election in the fall this year, and the outcome will have a significant implications for Ontario's future with respect to immigration. At the same time, we are seeing more actors speaking up not only about the economic benefits of immigration, but also the need to ensure that immigrants and refugees can thrive economically as well as culturally and socially. We have tremendous responsibilities ahead of us. In practical initiatives that support credential recognition, supporting immigrants and refugees to find good jobs or to start business, support civic engagement and cultural production. We are seeing a growing interest from a broad range of actors in wanting to change the narrative on refugees and on immigration through traditional media and social media, and it's a campaign that Okasi and our colleagues here in Ontario are working on with the United Way of Greater Toronto, especially given the negative narrative around refugee and refugee claimants and asylum seekers. We are seeing more and more Okasi member agencies connecting with local Indigenous organizations to build awareness, understanding, and better relations. And finally, it is very much falls on all of us to be present and engaged in the immigration discourse with all sectors and stakeholders to keep pushing for the kind of province we want to see, where all residents are counted and where all residents can participate. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, Amina.